So the new Adepta Sororitas Codex is just about out, leaks are currently doing the rounds, and we finally have a full picture of what this redesigned faction is going to look like. So let's take a moment to dive into this codex, dispense some hot takes, and talk about the top 7 best units in the new Adepta Sororitas. Let's do it! What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi. Today we're going to be talking about Adepta Sororitas, who just got a brand new codex with a ton of changes from their 8th edition incarnation. The codex took some of the most powerful, most abusive stuff in the faction, toned it down significantly, and brought up some of their less played unit options while giving them a whole host of new and interesting mechanics to interact with. Overall, it's a total paradigm shift on how Adepta Sororitas lists are going to be constructed in the future, and really, it's going to take a little while for the community to parse through everything that's in this codex and work out the most optimal builds for the faction. That said, that shouldn't stop us from talking about some of the best units, at least in my opinion. As always, if you like this style of content, remember to hit that like button, hit subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff. We talk about it all the time. I'm sure you've heard it a million times from every YouTuber ever, but it really helps and I appreciate it. Anyway, let's get into it. Top 7 best units in Adepta Sororitas. Starting down in number 7, we have a datasheet that's gotten a significant glow up since its 8th edition version. This is the Penitent engine. I made a video previously on the dichotomy between Penitent engines versus Mortifiers and how Mortifiers bizarrely had basically every advantage over top Penitent engines themselves. But now that gap has been closed pretty significantly. To be perfectly honest, I'm still not sure which version of this datasheet I would rather take. Mortifiers do get access to that heavy bolter profile, but in this codex, Penitent engines did get the Endless Suffering ability, which gives them the ability to advance and charge as well as additional distance on their pile-in and consolidations. On top of a base speed increase up to movement 8, that makes the Penitent engines the faster, more melee-oriented version of the two. Whereas Mortifiers had every advantage previously, Penitent engines definitely have something important going on. The difference between the two is exacerbated by the fact that the Holy Rage stratagem that previously allowed any Sororitas unit to advance and charge no longer does that, meaning that Sororitas have almost entirely lost access to that advance and charge. However, Penitent engines still have it on their datasheet. Despite the fact that their damage output from their version in 8th edition did decrease, with their flails only swinging 8 times instead of 12, I do think that Penitent engines have a pretty decent place in a more heavily armored version of a Sororitas list that's focusing on these vehicle-style units a little bit more heavily. Now, just last week, I made a video on the worst units for every faction in Warhammer 40k. So imagine my surprise when going through this Adepta Sororitas Codex, I actually have included my pick in that video for Sororitas. On this list of best units, number 6 is going to be the Dialogus. This model went from having some leadership affecting abilities that really did not matter, as well as the ability to manipulate miracle dice, which was nice, but an ability that was found elsewhere in the faction on units you were already taking that had additional abilities. With the introduction of the new battle hymn mechanic, Dialogi can come in bringing those litany-style abilities alongside the benefits that they already brought. This means that a Dialogus can fill the role that was previously filled by a preacher or a missionary, while still allowing you some miracle dice manipulation when you need it. While coming in at 50 points, they are significantly more expensive than a preacher. They do get access to the Adepta Sororitas specific battle hymns, allowing you to get access to +1 invulnerable save, exploding 6s in the shooting phase, or additional sacred rites for units within 6. On top of knowing War Hymn, the ability that is the evolution of the missionary or preacher's aura in the previous version of the codex, that means that the Dialogus brings a lot of flexibility to the role. Whether or not the Dialogus supersedes the missionary or preacher options, I don't know, but I do think that it is a very reasonable alternative. Moving on to the Exorcist, this is another unit that got a pretty significant side grade in the new codex, and while it did receive a couple stat decreases, moving from toughness 8 to toughness 7, with its strength 8 missile launcher profile moving from AP3 down to AP2, to match the profile of crack missiles, Exorcists did get a pretty big ability in the devastating refrain stratagem, which now allows them to target units outside line of sight, giving Sororitas an option for indirect fire that they did not have previously. And not just any indirect fire. This thing fires 3d3 crack missile profiles at 48-inch range, meaning they're able to target basically anything they need to. And with judicious use of miracle dice, especially with some miracle dice manipulation like that Dialogus we were just talking about, that allows exorcists to pick out enemy indirect fire before it's able to kill their own squishy units. Enemy artillery has always been a weak point for Adepta Sororitas since they have a tough time interacting with it, and exorcists now patch that hole to some extent. At 2 CP, the stratagem itself is relatively costly, so you don't really want to be using it every turn, but I can see a lot of Sororitas lists starting with a single Exorcist just for that pinpoint removal out of line of sight whenever you need it. And it is important to keep in mind, even without the use of that stratagem, this thing can still just shoot directly and deals the same amount of damage. That brings us to number 4, one of the new units in this Codex release, the Celestian Sacrosants. These ladies come with a very resilient defensive profile thanks to their storm shields, and in combination with some of the other units that we're going to talk about on this list, can put up a pretty good fight around the center of the table. Either bringing a Strength 6, 1 damage profile with AP 3, or a Strength 5, 2 damage melee profile, alongside a 2+ armor save and 4+ invulnerable save, as well as the bodyguard rule, and the ability to heroically intervene or set to defend against enemy charging units, giving them a 2+ weapon skill. The Sacrosants fight around the center of the table very effectively. The downside is a relatively expensive points cost at 14 points each for a 1 wound model, which is a little tough to swallow, but that 4+ invulnerable save should go a long way to keeping them alive, especially since Sisters are going to be a lot more resilient to things like smites in this new codex, with the ability to potentially deny any psychic power on a 5+. I'm interested to see if more Horde mode Sisters lists become a little bit more prevalent, maybe built around a bulwark of these Sacrosant units. I think that could be very powerful. And one of the reasons that I think that list archetype is reasonable is our number 3 pick, the Dogmata. This Elite's Choice is a brand new pick for the Adepta Sororitas army, and is a character that, in addition to some other abilities, gives a core unit within 6 inches objective secured. Now, anyone who's ever played against Space Marines and Rites of War knows how powerful the ability to give objective secured to units that don't normally have it is. And while it's certainly not on the same level as Rites of War, there are some benefits to the Dogmata's ability. First off, you choose the unit that's getting objective secured in your command phase, and that lasts until the start of your next command phase, meaning that if you're rocketing a unit like Sisters Repentia or Zephyrim out onto the table to fight over your opponent's objective, you can choose them to be objective secured, send them onto the objective, and they will obsec it away from your opponent regardless of their proximity to the Dogmata herself. Now, the other downside is that this ability can't target character units, so the Dogmata herself can't be objective secured, which is a big downside, although with how annoying objective secured characters is, pretty thankful that's not how it works. She also allows you to make ranged attacks while performing actions, which has some cool synergy with units like Seraphim, who may be able to fire twice while still performing an action, which is pretty cool. If that wasn't enough, she also notes hymns just like the Dialogus, meaning that despite the fact that she's a little bit more expensive, she's bringing some of that additional utility to your list in the same way. Units like Sacrosants and other melee-oriented units fighting over the middle of the table are going to be massively buffed by the Dogmata, and I expect to see a lot of them in Sisters lists in the future. Another unit that we've seen in basically every Sisters list ever, and that I think we'll continue to see into the distant future, is the Humble Canoness, our number 2 pick. The Canoness herself comes in at a very efficient profile, only at 50 points for a pretty decent stat line, but with some new and interesting abilities in the new codex, in the form of Blessings of the Faithful. These are chapter command style upgrades that you can attach to either Canonesses or Palatines. Each one has its own cost, and they all have some incredibly powerful abilities. The blessing that you choose has 2 abilities, one of which that is a passive buff, like +1 strength and damage to your melee attacks, for example, or -1 to wound the character herself. However, discarding Miracle Dice gives you a second aura ability with a range dependent on the value of Miracle Dice that you discarded. Not only does this give Sororitas players way more to do with their garbage Miracle Dice rolls, Miracle Dice results of 2, for example, were pretty useless in the previous version of the Codex since you wanted to keep your 1s to automatically pass morale checks, whereas high numbers were good for charges or damage rolls, and those 2s and 3s were never very good. However, now discarding a 2 gives you a 3-inch aura with one of the secondary abilities on this Blessings of the Faithful. Some of the incredibly powerful auras that these characters can generate are -1 to hit for any core or character units within a 1 to 6 inch range, depending on the value of dice you discard. An aura that removes invulnerable saves from enemy units inside the range against melee attacks made by your units, or the ability to prevent your opponent from re-rolling any dice rolls against units inside the aura. All of these abilities are phenomenally powerful, and while they do bleed your resources over the course of the game, some of them as just one-use abilities are going to be incredibly good. And a lot of the passive abilities are also incredible, including a Temporal Mortis effect that makes one enemy unit within 3 inches ineligible to fight until the end of the fight phase, which is always a good ability to have. Overall, Canonesses are already one of the most efficient and powerful characters in the Sororitas Codex and have just gotten a lot more utility with these Blessings of the Faithful ability. This is a super flavorful ability, and I think the way it interacts with your Miracle Dice Pool is incredibly cool, and I'm really excited to see it on the table. Moving on, let's talk about a couple honorable mentions. Now, I wasn't sure if I wanted to put them in the top of the list here, but obviously the premier damage units in the Sororitas Codex are units like Retributors, Repentia, and Zephyrim, all of which have seen a little bit of a downgrade from their previous version. Talking about how units have degraded since their 8th edition codex doesn't sound quite as exciting to me as talking about ones that have been significantly improved, so I didn't put them at the top, but I do think they're still worth mentioning as some of the best units in the codex. They just have to be used a little bit more judiciously. The fact that most of the buffing abilities in the faction moved from being passive auras to being command phase targeted abilities means that most of these units can't benefit from them if they're coming out of reserve or disembarking from a transport, which means that most of the delivery systems that Sororitas used for them are not going to be quite as useful. In addition, melee units like Zephyrim and Repentia are going to be much more difficult to deliver when starting on the table since they've lost access to the ability to advance and charge. So smart play from Adepta Sororitas players is going to be required to deliver those units. On top of that, the damage output of Zephyrms dropped a little bit, gaining an attack in exchange for their ability to reroll wounds when they charge. However, they did get access to a +1 to wound stratagem for 2 CP, which is a little pricey, but is nice to have. Retributors as well lost access to Storm of Retribution and their ability to move and shoot without penalty. However, taking them in Argent Shroud counts them as stationary anyway and allows them to advance and shoot with their heavy weapons, which makes up for the loss of range on multi-meltas. So while I do think these units have certainly gotten worse, I don't think that the era of seeing them in most Sororitas lists is quite over. Seraphim are another unit that's in a similar boat, and while they're still one of the premier action-performing units in the faction and even in the game, so they're no longer able to clear out screens for other deep-striking Sororitas units, which is one of their most important roles in a Sororitas army. They also lost access to +1 AP on their pistol weapons from Order of the Bloody Rose, which is another big downside for the unit. That said, their core functionality still remains, and I think we're still going to see them in a lot of lists. Another unit that I think has been significantly improved is Mortifiers. I did mention them at the top when we talked about Penitent engines, but Mortifiers got a little bit tankier, gaining a 5+ damage ignore roll, although they did lose the ability to advance and fire their heavy bolters. That said, Mortifiers bringing in 2 heavy bolters apiece for a whopping 24 shots on the approach, while being more difficult to kill to enemy attacks coming back at them and having a decent melee profile, I think still puts them in the running for a solid unit in the Codex. And with that, let's go ahead and move on to our number 1 pick for the Adepta Sororitas 9th edition Codex. This is Morven Val. Coming in at a bargain, 265 points, Morven Val is a Supreme Commander for the Adepta Sororitas, meaning she can fill that coveted Supreme Command detachment slot. This model is absolutely incredible. Not only does she look really cool, which is a significant upside, but she also has a host of phenomenal abilities on top of some good damage output as well. First off, she's an 8-wound character, which means she can be lookout sirred. However, that low wound count is a little deceptive, because she halves damage from essentially every damage source that she receives, having the damage characteristic of attacks that target her and ignoring mortal wounds on a 4+, meaning that despite the fact that she's 8 wounds and normally can't be targeted, she'll probably eat 12 to 16 damage before she actually dies, which is already difficult since she has a 4+ invulnerable save and a 2+ armor save built in. If that survivability wasn't enough, she can also shoot back at you pretty well, carrying a strength 6 heavy bolter, as well as the equivalent of a cyclone missile launcher, able to fire 2 crack missile shots or 2 frag missile shots, on top of a solid melee profile, with a strength 5 damage 1 profile with 10 attacks, or a strength 8 3 flat damage profile with the sniper rule to deal additional mortal wounds on wound rolls of 6. This means that Morvenn Vahl can form the core of a Sororitas list and serve as a counterpunch unit while providing some fire support. And on top of that, she has a ton of powerful support abilities, giving a blanket 6-inch aura of reroll once to hit and wound for any Adepta Sororitas unit, regardless of order, within 6 inches, as well as a targeted full reroll to a core or character, giving something rerolls to hit and wound, basically some old school Guilliman action going on. She also has a once per game double fight, very similar to a Master Archon, allowing her to swing again at the end of the fight phase if she's still engaged with her target. And assuming she's your Warlord, which she generally has to be, she'll be full rerolling her hits and wounds in the fight phase on top of that. This means she can target another character or unit with her full rerolled aura and still benefit from those full rerolls herself thanks to that Warlord trait. Morvenn Vahl is the complete package. She does damage in both the shooting and fight phases, is ridiculously difficult to kill, and is a phenomenal force multiplier at the heart of any Sororitas list. I would be surprised to see a Sororitas army who doesn't bring this lady, and I am not super excited about facing her across the table. But anyway, that's all I have to say about the new Adepta Sororitas Codex. Let me know what you thought about this ranking down in the comments down below. Did you agree with the units that I picked? Do you have any other sleeper hits inside the faction that you think I missed? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. I also want to throw a big thanks over to my patrons over at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. YouTube channel members, you can join in the join link down below the video. We also have some advanced tactics videos for those folks coming out. I'm going to be starting to talk about the GT 2021 packet, and we're still going through every single mission and talking about them in depth. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and join on the YouTube channel membership or on Patreon. It's available on both. And Twitch subscribers. All those people help support me, help me make videos, and I really appreciate them. Also, I talked to some people over the weekend, and they didn't know that I have custom objective markers and some custom merch available. You can find links for all of those down below in the description as well. Anyway, thanks again for watching all the way to the end. I really appreciate it. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.